Analysis, Mr. Spock.
Alien weapon is a form of plasma energy, Captain. Exact composition unknown. Guidance system unknown.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Flicks Files. Today I thought I would do a slightly different retrospective and review and just have a light-hearted chat about a movie that I've always enjoyed, but I know to quite a lot of science fiction fans it doesn't quite have the love that I give it, which I've always found kind of odd. So I'm going to try and explain to you why I like this particular movie. So the movie is Star Trek the Motion Picture, which was released in 1979. And this was like the very first film containing the original Star Trek crew. And it kicked off a series of 6 Star Trek films. And then I think it was in 1994, Star Trek Generations came out, and that started a series of 5 films that used the Star Trek The Next Generation crew. So I've always liked Star Trek The Motion Picture for the fact that it is the first movie, but in my mind it's possibly the truest Star Trek film out there when you think of what the original series was about. And I would rate it quite high up. If I listed all the Star Trek movies, I would probably rate this, say, 3rd. Star Trek 2, The Wrath of Khan being my favourite, and then Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home being a 2nd, and then the motion picture I would rate at number 3. That's how much I really like it. And I can remember seeing this at the cinema in 1979 when it was released. And I can remember people walking out of the cinema when a particular scene was playing, which I'll talk about shortly. And when I look back, I always think, gosh, was it really that bad at the time that people just walked out, and a lot of people call it boring, but I don't. I really like it. So before I get into the film, I thought I would just show you a little curiosity that I have in relation to this movie. I have a couple of books to do with Star Trek the Motion Picture. I won't show them in this video. If you look back at some of my previous videos, I have some to do with various film books, and Star Trek the Motion Picture appears in one of those. But what I will show you today is something that I've held on to way back since 1979. And at that time, in the UK, there's a breakfast cereal company called Weetabix, and they used to do film promotions. And the 2 that stick in my mind when I was a kid were this one, and then they also did a big promotion for Flash Gordon when that was released the following year. But when Star Trek the Motion Picture was, on the horizon, so it had not opened at this point, Weetabix did a big promotion for it. And I can remember seeing the box on the shelf, advertising Star Trek. And I don't have that box, and I've seen copies for sale on eBay that are really expensive. But what I do have is the full set of collectible cards that were inside these packs. And I have the full set, which I'm really proud of. And I collected them when I was 9 years old. And I've kept them all these years, and I've just kept them in nice condition. And I can remember, being fascinated with them and looking at them. This is before the movie came out, And some of the characters on the cards, I was disappointed that when I saw the movie, I thought, I never saw those particular characters. And sure enough, they are in the movie. They just, in like one scene in the background for like 3 seconds. So there's no wonder that I missed them. But yeah, I've always liked this movie, and I like the setup for this movie because to me, classic Star Trek is about the crew, going where no man has gone before and just going out into the great unknown of space and seeing what they encounter, and then having fun with seeing how they deal with what they encounter. And Star Trek the Motion Picture is about a giant cloud that is approaching Earth. It always makes me laugh that they say that the size of this cloud is 82 AUs in diameter. Now, I'm a slight amateur astronomer, and I know that an AU is an astronomical unit. And one astronomical unit is the distance between the Earth and the Sun, which I think is about 92 million miles. So if you think that they measure this cloud as 82 astronomical units, it's huge. And whether they knew that when they wrote it, but if that's the case, and that is the size of this cloud, it would engulf the entire solar system, never mind the Earth. So yeah, the movie kind of begins with a terrific sequence where these Klingon battle cruisers are approaching this cloud, and they're scanning it and they're trying to work out what it is. And Klingons, being Klingons, think, well, we don't know what it is, so we'll just fire some photon torpedoes at it and destroy it, because that's just how they work. That's their mindset. So they attempt to destroy it, and of course they get absolutely nowhere. And the cloud fires these huge plasma balls at these battle cruisers, and it completely kind of, I always call it de-resing, but it kind of just completely disintegrates them down to their atomic parts, basically, and everybody on board, and destroys the whole lot of them. And this is picked up by a nearby space station. And it's the space station that plots its course, and they realize that it's heading directly to Earth. So it's at that point that Starfleet get involved. And we then kind of introduced to the three main characters, Spock, Kirk, and McCoy, in three really cool ways. So the first one we introduced to is Spock, and he's on Vulcan. And he's like towards the end of this ceremony called the Colonar ceremony. And it's meant to be like a final purging of his residual emotions, just as they're about to, put it on him like an Olympic gold medal. He stops them, and he's obviously giving off vibes that he's got something on his mind or something's troubling him. And then it cuts to Starfleet headquarters, and we see Kirk arrive in a shuttle. And, the first time we see him is through the little window of the shuttle door. And, you have to remember that this was a huge moment back in 1979, because it had been, over a decade, I think, since they're on television. So it was great to see these characters, back in, the ones we love so much, and just seeing them, after all that time. And at this point, Kirk is an admiral. He's obviously worked his way up the ranks. And we learn that he's been assigned to sit in the captain's chair of the newly refitted Enterprise. So there's a moment where he gets on board the Enterprise and he meets up with the current captain, which is a character called Captain Decker, played by an actor called Stephen Collins. And they have a cold moment where he takes him to one side and explains that he's going to take over the Enterprise. And the reasoning is that because of his experience of dealing with these strange anomalies, and they're going to go out there in the Enterprise and intercept this cloud to try and work out what it wants and what its intentions are. And Stephen Collins' character is obviously very bitter about this, because he's the captain. He doesn't easily want to give up the captain's chair, but he kind of relents, and he takes on the role of science officer, because Spock isn't available. He's just not there. And there's a really, really grim moment near the beginning of the film where the Enterprise is finishing its refit, and they're obviously going through all these checks. But we get the impression that they're having to rush them because they need to get going, and try and intercept this cloud as quickly as they can. And they're going to beam on board 2 crew members, but something goes wrong with the transporter, as in it's not calibrated properly or something. And as they're being transported onto the Enterprise, they like have trouble forming, is what they say. And, there's like these horrible screams, and then the transporter shuts down. And there's a bit where Kirk like goes on the intercom and says, have you got them? Did they come back safely? And this voice kind of says,
Enterprise. What we got back didn't live long, fortunately.
Yeah, so it's like a grim moment. But it also leads into a little bit of comedy, because they then fix the transporter and McCoy gets beamed on board. And when he first arrives, he's not happy about it. When he's kind of become a bit bitter in his old age, bless him. But again, it's lovely to see him back in the role, on the ship. Yeah, so they make a beeline for the cloud, and there's a sequence where they try going to warp speed, but because the engines aren't properly calibrated at this point, they end up being pulled into a wormhole. So they have to kind of lock everything down. And there's this sequence where Kirk orders them to fire, I think, to use the lasers to try and destroy this wormhole. And Deckard shouts, "No, delay that phaser order." And you can see Kirk thinking, yeah, how dare you countermand me, sort of thing. And Deckard orders Chekhov to use photon torpedoes instead, which they do, and they destroy the wormhole. And afterwards, he explains to Kirk that because of the engine imbalance, that the power for the phasers is routed through the engines. And because the engines were imbalanced, that the phasers wouldn't have worked. So by acting quickly, Deckard saved the ship. And Kirk realizes this, and he gets the impression that Deckard is competing with him, and trying to prove to him that he should really be in charge. So it's this nice little dynamic that goes on there. It's there that Spock turns up. He arrives on a little shuttle, and he explains that while he was on Vulcan, he was picking up like distressful thoughts coming from this cloud. So he felt compelled to investigate. And then we get into a sequence where a light heads towards the Enterprise from the cloud, and it manifests on the deck of the ship as being an alien probe. And they see that it's scanning all of their computer records. So Spock like smashes the computer in the middle of it doing this, and it attacks a character called Ilea, who's like, I think she's another science officer, I believe, and she's got a bit of a romantic past with Deckard, and she gets de-resed and disappears, only to return to the ship as like a clone of her old self. And they realize that the cloud has turned it into kind of a vessel where she can interact with the ship and the crew to gather information. And she tells Kirk and the crew that Vija, as her name is the name of the cloud, is looking for its creator, which they're all kind of, its creator? We don't know where it's come from. And that's kind of the plot, is where they fly the Enterprise deeper into this cloud, and they're heading for the center of the cloud. And, it's really intriguing when you watch it for the first time, because as they fly into the cloud, we treat it to some like really kind of 2001-esque sequences of flying through various neon tunnels and lights, and all these different formations of clouds as they get nearer to the center of this cloud. And I should mention at this point that the visual effects were supervised by Douglas Trumbull. And Douglas Trumbull worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey. And then he did the effects for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And then he worked on this. And then he did Blade Runner. So, he's kind of a dab hand at doing effects of that age. And talking of the effects, one of the best sequences in the movie for me, and this is a sequence that people walked out of when I saw it in the cinema, which amazed me because, and I've spoken to people since where I've mentioned this movie and they went, yeah, it's okay, but the bit where they first fly up to the Enterprise when it's in dry dock's really boring. And I think, God, that's like one of the best sequences in the movie. And it is, and near the beginning of the movie when Kirk's first getting on board the Enterprise, Scotty flies him in a little shuttle and he flies him towards this big orbital shipyard where the Enterprise is being refitted. And it's quite a long sequence, I admit. It's like a good 4 or 5 minutes of very slow flybys as we fly past the Enterprise and we see it from all these different angles. But it looks incredible, and the effects really give a sense of scale and the majesty. I mean, you've got to remember, this is like this Starship Enterprise. And much like with the crew, this is the first time we've seen them since the series. So you think surely it deserves a bit of an extended introduction to the movie, and it's a lovely, lovely sequence, when they end up flying right up close to the Enterprise and then they dock with it. And it's just lovely. And I've never understood why that was the sequence that made people walk out of the cinema, but, each to their own. So skipping forward, they do eventually get to the middle of the cloud and, they start finding the structure of it and see that it's this huge, huge spaceship. And to cut a long story short, they eventually get right to the middle of the cloud, to the middle of the structure. And Ilea leads them to this central area where there's a very small kind of retro mechanical satellite sat in the middle of this big proscenium. And they kind of walk round it and they're looking closer. And Kirk notices that on the side of this sort of satellite, it does say V'ger, VGER. And then as he rubs the dirt away with his fingers, he sees that it actually says Voyager. And then it says Voyager 6. Now, this is quite interesting because in reality, there were 2 Voyager probes that were released by NASA in 1977 that were sent off into the solar system with the basis of, they would photograph planets as they pass by and transmit data back to the Earth. So in Star Trek The Motion Picture, they fictionalized this program to the point where, there was a Voyager 6. And they find out that this probe, this Voyager 6, was picked up by some advanced, computerized, fully robotic alien race somewhere in dim and distant space. And they examined this probe and they saw that its simple programming was just learn all that is learnable, know all that is knowable, and then transmit that back to your creator. So what had happened was that these robotic aliens had kitted out this little probe with this huge structure in this big cloud to help it finish its mission. And it had gathered so much data that this probe had actually kind of become self-aware to the point where it was asking itself the question of, is this all that I am? Is there nothing more? So it was looking for its God, as it were. And and it's like a brilliant, brilliant concept. I love it. Even talking about it makes me think, I want to watch this again. So they think, well, if we send the probe the code to say this is what you need to do to transmit your data, that will prove to the probe that humans, or carbon-based units, as Ilea calls them, that will prove that, we are its creator. And at the last second, just as they're about to key in this code, which will order the satellite to transmit its data, it short circuits itself. And they're trying to wonder why. And I think it's Deckard that kind of says, well, it obviously wants to meld with its creator, and try and advance beyond itself. And McCoy's like going, is that possible? And it's there that Deckard decides that he's going to sacrifice himself with Ilea, and they're going to meld with Vija. And as I say, Deckard, he has a kind of bit of a history with Ilea. They had a bit of a relationship earlier on in their lives. So when she got taken and turned into this probe, he's trying to connect to her throughout the movie and trying to bring out the real Ilea inside her. So at the end of the movie, he kind of manages this, and she starts looking at him with like love in her eyes, as if she's remembering who he is. So, the very end of the movie is where they're kind of de-resed into the Vija system, which kind of just makes the whole thing disappear, and it just becomes like a faceless, invisible entity in the universe, I guess. It never really explains what happens to them. But that's sort of the end of the movie. And yeah, and I really like it. And as I say, I think of all the Star Trek movies, this is like the closest in spirit to the TV series. And I think it was a really good foundation to build on with the rest of the movies. I mean, obviously it was, because we ended up with all these other Star Trek movies. But after this, if you think of all the other movies that came after, they all kind of followed an arc, with the death of Spock and his resurrection, and, even into Star Trek 4, Spock is still trying to get his mind back, so he's not quite himself. Whereas Star Trek: The Motion Picture is a singular movie. It has a beginning, middle, and end. And it could have ended there. If they didn't make another Star Trek movie, then it would have been very sad that we wouldn't have got Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. But, Star Trek: The Motion Picture would still have survived as its own little thing. And it's for that reason I think it just deserves more credit. So whether you agree with me or not, I am going to rate it like the third best Star Trek movie out of all of them. And I've got it on Blu-ray and 4K. So I've got the original Blu-ray Star Trek box set of the first 6 movies. And then sometime later, the 4K box was announced of the first 4 movies. So being desperate to own this in 4K, I picked up that initial box. Of course, they then re-released it with the first 6 movies in 4K, but I've just stuck with the one that I bought. So as a result, I have this on physical media 3 times because I have it on 4K and I have it on 2 Blu-rays, one in each box set. And interestingly, they released a director's edition version of this movie, where they went back and redid some of the visual effects, kind of like what they did with Highlander 2. If anybody watched my older, one of the first videos I put up on this channel was a review of Highlander 2, and in that I talked about how they redid all the visual effects. Well, they kind of did this with the director's edition of Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and enhanced all the effects around Vija and the cloud, and the sequence at the end where they're making their way towards the big proscenium where the probe is situated. And I have seen the director's edition, and I like it, but I don't like it enough to want to buy it a 4th time, to have like a 4th copy on physical media. I'm quite happy just to stick with as it was released theatrically and how the effects looked, the original effects, because that's what I'm used to. I just prefer that look. So yeah, so that is my history with Star Trek: The Motion Picture and why I love it so much. So I hope that's made you, if you've already seen this, maybe you've not watched it in a long, long time, maybe it's encouraged you to think, oh, maybe I'll give it another go and, see if he's right. And I hope I am right, and you do watch it and think, yeah, that was a really good movie. But I love it. So there we go. So if you got this far, thank you so much. If you enjoyed that, give me a thumbs up. And I will see you on the next one, guys.